Hi, my name's Jessica Knight, and I'm the Research Communications Specialist for CVM. Now that you've learned a bit about the what and the why of Research Day from Dr. McHugh in the introductory video, I want to introduce the next video in our series, which is about understanding your audience and developing your message. This was filmed last year by Dr. McHugh and Research Office alum Mike Oakes. And they cover some really useful tools for this work of identifying and pitching your audience with your science. It's crucial groundwork for creating your Research Day submissions, or really for any successful communications. So they're tools not just for Research Day, but for your future as scientists doing this important work of connecting with the public. So please watch and reach out with any questions and plan to attend our hands-on follow-up workshop on March 7th. And you can find information about that on the Research Day website. Thanks.
We're going to talk today about identifying audiences, which is part of a bigger goal that we have in helping you translate your research to the general public or people who are actually going to use it. And we say it through these workshops, but I'll repeat again, really the impact of your science is related to whether or not the people who can use it have the information. It's interesting. I had a conversation yesterday with the chief scientific officer of the Canine Health Foundation. And she was talking to me about some of their goals. And one of their top goals as she's taken over that organization is to better be able to translate the science that they fund to general audiences. And her comment to me was, it's something that we aren't trained to do as scientists. She's also a DVM PhD. She said, but it's something that's critically important. And even the researchers that we support, some of them have learned along the way how to communicate science and others haven't. So we're trying to figure out how as an organization we can fill in that gap. And so I shared with her a little bit about what we're trying to do with Research Day and training students. And she was actually very excited about that because as somebody who accepts donations and funds science as an organization, they recognize that having an impact means translating science. So just a little sharing a little bit of tidbit or a little anecdote about the importance. And actually, as we talk about our target audience, one of them is funders like the Canine Health Foundation. But what do we mean when we say target audience to start? Your target audience is a group of people that you want to reach with your research or your expertise in general. So it may be a particular piece of research, a particular project, or just your area of expertise in research or science. Typically, the audiences that we're trying to communicate to care about what we're doing because it impacts them or someone or something they care about. And so sometimes they come into this equation, they already care about what we're doing, but there's a lot of times where we're trying to make the audience care about what we're doing because they don't understand it well enough to be in the position to know that they should care about it or that it is impactful to them. And then sometimes there are people who are just curious about science overall. And typically that curiosity is driven by an underlying need or want to understand how your research impacts them. And so just to sort of summarize it, the audience is people who care or should care about your research because it impacts them. They may or may not know that at the get-go, but that's really what we're focused on here. So there's lots of ways to group target audiences. They could be grouped by occupation. And when I think about research in veterinary medicine, for example, grouping by occupation could be the scientific manuscript that we are communicating to other researchers versus perhaps veterinarians who are practicing that would use the information that we generate to help them better diagnose or treat patients. And animal owners, that would be a third one. They, of course, have professional occupations across the board, but the occupation that they have that we care about often in communicating veterinary research is that they own or invested emotionally or financially in the animals that our research pertains to. They can also be divided by interests. And so I'll give an example. I've recently been part of a national effort It's called the Agility Dog Health Network. And so it's really targeted at people who use their dogs to compete in dog sports, including agility. So in that instance, it's actually a niche area, but a highly motivated audience who cares about how their sport and their hobby impacts the health of their dogs, and they consider their dogs athletes and teammates. And so they're separated from dog owners who enjoy the dog that lays on the couch. Um, Interest area could be someone who's interested in virology versus genetics, etc. We can separate out people by their values. And sometimes it's important to separate them by geography. I'll give an example that we were just talking about in one of our communication strategy meetings this week with the research and communications team. We talked about chronic wasting disease and how the audience around chronic wasting disease and who cares as far as funders and sometimes audience is impacted by geography. That is a disease that happens in certain regions. And so depending on geography, we're targeting audiences at certain levels or certain regions. That's also one where the public audience can be divided by interest. So we think about hunters and people who consume venison as being an important audience. We can also group our audiences by media consumption. So not only where do they get their information, but what type of media do they prefer? Written media, television or video, etc. We know that age and gender are important, both because the impacts of the research can be divided by that, but also because the values and sort of the familiarity or even political leanings can be divided by demographic things such as age and gender. And then I think one that is really, really important, and I know when speaking to my students across the communication of science spectrum, whether it be to other researchers, to a more general scientific audience, to veterinarians or to the public, is their prior knowledge of the subject. And this is one that really trips us up because we always assume more prior knowledge than our audience likely has. It's very hard to remember what it was like before you knew something. And I always use the example here of, I remember my freshman year in veterinary school thinking that the most important thing that I learned was the whole new language that we used. And I used to go to the optional student rounds in the morning. And at the beginning of freshman year, they would talk about cases and what was going on. And they'd use these terms that I had no idea what they were. But by the end of the freshman year, I'd basically learned the language. It's really hard for me to remember actually which bits of that language I learned and which things I knew before I got to veterinary school. And so going back and really dissecting your audience's prior knowledge of the subject, I think is something that's quite important. And even when you're presenting science, what you present, for example, for my students to a bunch of genomic scientists at a meeting is going to be at a different level than when they present in graduate student seminar to general scientists. So that's something that is often missed. It shouldn't be the same presentation, even for two different audiences full of PhD level scientists. And that certainly applies when you're talking to the general public. We're thinking about practitioners in veterinary human medicine versus the general public, et cetera. So just a few examples. I think I've talked a lot about these, but again, these are ones that we really think about. Pet owners and consumers, I've alluded to quite a bit, but they probably have different motivations and interest level than somebody who potentially wants to donate to your research. Donors to research typically want to hear about an area that they care about a lot. Maybe they lost their horse to laminitis, so they want to fund metabolic disease, for example. So they probably are coming at it from a different level. They have different goals and preconceived notions. The media, for the most part, wants to be able to relay what you tell them to their audience. So if it's trade media in a certain area, for example, agriculturally related media in a swine journal, those journalists are going to have a really different interest or level of background and interest in what they want to report versus the local television news station. Prospective students have certain things that they're interested in, and for the students on the call and those who were students at some point in their life, which capture the rest of you, when you're considering where you want to go and get your education, you have certain questions and things that you want to know about. And alumni also want to hear about what's happening at their alma mater, but their perspective is different. Policymakers, so we have different research groups within our college that spend time speaking to policymakers or talking about, in particular, things that are locally or regionally important to Minnesota and fund part of their research based on the legislature deciding to put money towards those efforts. We, of course, spend a lot of time learning how to communicate science to our peers when we're in graduate school, and that's probably the area we're most familiar with. But other things are industry partners. They're going to be different because when they want to hear about science and invest in science, an industry partner is always going to think about how can they leverage that information or invest in that information to result in some sort of commercial product that results in money at the end of the day. And so when we speak to them, we should be thinking with the fact that that is their final lens. And then the last thing is the average person. And that's communicating with your family or your niece or nephew, like Mike talked about. But if I had $1 for every time a scientist or student told me that their family has no idea what they do when they try to explain it to them in Christmas, I would have retired a decade ago. But if that's you and you're in that situation, then it probably is actually should be motivation to work on your elevator pitch or your sort of average person level, non-scientist, non-expert level elevator pitch of what you do. And Mike's going to talk about that later, but maybe it's an opportunity to practice that in the next major holiday. When you're home or you're with family, you can try your new bright and shiny elevator pitch and see if they finally understand what it is that you do.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of nice to see the light bulb go on.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's important to also consider the average person also fits into all of these other target audiences at some level. And to that end, there's really not one general audience or lay audience. They're all informed. Every average person is informed by a set of values and cultural constructs. And so that's, it probably makes endeavors like this, like trying to really understand your audience, more difficult. But it's important to remember there isn't just one audience that you're speaking to ever.
That's a great point, Mike. Thanks for pointing that out, because it is important. You've got every audience will be heterogeneous. So you want to pick and speak to the people that are there. And sometimes you have to make decisions based on which audience is most important of the heterogeneous audience that you're speaking to. Oh, great point. So we've talked a lot about audience, and I think that it can be hard when you sit down to really find your audience or think about your audience. And actually, I really encourage all of you, and I do this myself, is to sit down before you start putting together a talk and think about the audiences that are in the room and what it is they want to hear and from what perspective are they approaching your work. And a tool that we have found that has been quite useful, that was actually developed at the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. So we've had them come and give seminars at the university level, is the audience identification grid. So I'm going to talk through this tool just a little bit and tell you what it is and what it's about. We won't have a chance to necessarily work through this tool today, but I think it's something to put in your back pocket to really force yourself to stop and think about the audience or audiences that you're speaking to as you're planning your talk. So this audience identification grid or message planning matrix Basically, along the first column are different potential audiences. And so you don't have to use these audiences. These are some examples. You can add more audiences. Maybe you want to break it down into veterinarians, animal owners, and industry sponsors. But think about all the different audiences. And then for each audience, really think about putting yourself in their shoes and taking their perspective first. So what is their current point of view about your work? That's going to be different from a funder or sponsor than it might be for a competitor or somebody who's a more general audience, who's a naysayer, who doesn't believe in the area of work that you're doing, doesn't believe in the impacts of what you're doing. So the easiest example here would be if you studied climate change and a naysayer doesn't believe that climate change is real, versus talking to somebody or an organization that solely funds climate change research. But it is quite interesting that regardless of the area of research that you have, there will be naysayers who fundamentally start out not believing what you're doing is real. And you really have to think about how do you turn around what they're thinking. Versus for a funder and a sponsor, part of communicating with them is often they want to hear that the money they invested was put to good use and that there's impacts and outcomes. Or it could be at the beginning of a project and you're writing a grant, for example, to them. They want to know that this is a good investment of money and the limited funds that they have. The next thing is to think about how they feel. And so as scientists, we've been really trained to think about data and facts and clear evidence. But we know as human beings, that is not how we make decisions. There's lots of research and literature about this fact. There's a couple of really good books that talk about this, but we think we're making rational decisions, but the vast majority, over 90% of our decisions are emotional. So for each audience, you need to figure out how emotionally connected are they to start? What is their level of interest? And also what it would take to get them emotionally connected to the work that you do. And part of that is the WIFM, or what's in it for me, which you have to think about for each audience.
That's a good one. What's in it for me?
Why, are they connected, or why should they be connected? And a lot of times we're in a situation in which we need to actually help them understand why they should feel an emotional connection. The next thing is what is it that you want this audience to do? For a horse owner, it might be that I want that part of my audience to go home and change the way they manage their horses with a particular genetic disease, which is a really different outcome than I want a funder to do. I want the funder to listen to what I have to say and be excited about giving me more money to do research and support our program. With a competitor, it might be that you want this competitor to appreciate the work that you're doing and recognize that you're doing valuable science that is adding to the body of knowledge in your area. Could be that you realize that you could work with your competitor as collaborators and get more done. And you really want to convince them that they should come on board and you could work together to achieve more science. And so once you know what you want them to do, and sort of where they are and thinking and feeling to start, the last column is really that shift that you want. And the last example is one that I gave, a shift from competitor to collaborator, perhaps, or a shift from a naysayer to an advocate, or perhaps it's a shift from an advocate to a funder or sponsor because it's somebody in industry who believes in what you do, but they're not yet supporting your work. So I think just taking the time, and this doesn't take that much time, 10 to 15 minutes, to really think about the audiences and where they are and where you want them to be, helps you plan your message in a way that's effective and communicates your thoughts.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Molly. And that's really the first step in, I mean, a lot of these things are fluid, but trying to identify that audience and their attitudes is really the first step in developing and tailoring our key messages to them. And I'm going to say our a lot. I realize I'm not a scientist. I don't have a PhD. I hope you'll forgive me, but I like to kind of think about us and talk about us all as being a part of the same team, because ultimately I think we really are. We all have the same goals to get your work out into the world and make it matter. So when you hear me say we and us, that's where I'm coming from, and I hope that's okay with you. It's worth noting that much like identifying audiences, because Molly's right, it shouldn't take that much time, but it's going to be something that kind of morphs over time. It's not a small task, and creating your message isn't a small task either, but it is really important to effectively communicate science. So for message crafting, this is another helpful tool, the message box. There's no magic bullet or one specific template to develop an effective message to communicate your science. There are many methods and many schools of thought, but we think the message box is a good one because it asks the communicator to break down the research and the context around it into its component parts, and then to assess the relative value of those parts and give weight to them. We're trying to decide what parts make the cut and what parts make the cutting room floor, essentially. Therefore, we think this tool is a great way to kind of zero in, hone in on your message, which is a necessary step towards simplifying your message before delivering that message to a reporter or your peers or your friends at a dinner party. Message box was designed with key principles of science communication in mind, at least this specific message box that we're talking about, which we'll discuss where it comes from shortly. First among those principles is that your audience does not share your expertise almost across the board, even when you're talking to other scientists, whether you're addressing your peers at a conference or a lawmaker or a reporter or the person on the street. Your audience doesn't know the scientific realm of your science like you do. So we need to convey it to them. To do that, we need to consider that cognitive studies show the human brain can really only absorb 3 to 5 things at a time. I'm sure some of you have heard this. The rule of 3 kind of harkens to this. And that makes it critical to identify those points about your science that are vital for your audience to know, and then to share just those points. And that means you'll end up leaving a lot on the cutting room floor, generally. Another key principle of science communication is that scientists don't communicate the same way as the rest of the world, or they traditionally haven't. I think that's getting better now, but traditionally they haven't. Take the academic publication format, the longtime domain of science communication, for example. A publication starts with an introduction and a background, usually, and then it goes into methods, results, and analysis. And then finally, the big findings, the conclusion, the discussion. Generally speaking, the rest of the world communicates in the opposite manner. What did the study find and why does it matter? They want to know the findings right away. So that's what comes first for them. It's important to acknowledge, I think, the difference between how scientists traditionally communicate and how the rest of the world communicates before we set out to craft our message. Third, studies have found that simply explaining new knowledge to people or buying into a knowledge deficit model isn't an effective way to win hearts and minds. Rather, the average person intakes new information through the lens of their own values and cultural identities, and might reject information that threatens those things. We talked about this a bit in our previous workshop. that it's vitally important to continually think about and put a premium on building trust with your audiences and conveying shared values. That's not easy, like we talked about, and it takes time, but it is critical to ultimately winning those hearts and minds. You've heard us say this before, and you'll definitely hear us say it again today even, but don't fall back on sciencey language. Jargon clutters communication with most audiences and excludes people from the conversation. If you have to define terminology for your audience when you're sending your message, that tacks on to the 3 to 5 things that they can remember at a time. And all of a sudden, they're not receiving the message that you're trying to send. I considered putting that last point, avoid jargon, in all caps to really drive home this message, but decided that a period could get the point across while remaining civilized. However, if you'd like to think about that as in all caps, please feel free. So strategic messaging calls for thoughtful and intentional planning rather than blindly trusting your intuition. The US FDA report titled Communicating Risks and Benefits, an Evidence-Based User's Guide, warns us that using our intuition to develop key messaging should raise alarm bells. The report notes that the best communications do begin in a communicator's head, but that the worst communications also begin in a communicator's head. The ones that miss the mark usually do so because the communicator isn't a part of the target audience. So understanding your audience is critical. That's going to be a common theme. Good messaging then starts with knowing whom you're talking to, explaining who you are and why you're talking to them. It hits your key points early and often. It uses pictures, imagery, analogies, ideally, and it's relevant to your audience and sensitive to their place in the world. I went one too far. So this is one example. You can find some different message box templates out in the world. This one comes from Compass Science Communication. It was developed by a name some of you might have heard of, Nancy Barron. She's Compass's Director of Science Outreach. And she's author of a book called Escape from the Ivory Tower, a guide to making your science matter. As you can see, there are 5 matters to address here. It's really kind of organic. You start where you want and you kind of flesh it out as you go. Begin where it feels comfortable with you. Maybe you start from a problem. I saw a problem a couple of times in the chat, and that was my instinct when I first started this too, because I'm going to guess your research focus started with recognizing a problem somewhere. And so maybe you start with a problem that you're addressing, and maybe that helps you even narrow down the issue that's at the heart of the message box. Often the issue that you'll start out with might be really broad and grandiose, but in order to, I think, create effective messaging that's going to resonate with people, you probably want to really kind of narrow it down. Let me take a look. Molly always starts with a problem. I like that. That's good. Thank you for weighing in. So on the next slide, we'll take a look at some things that can help you, some ideas that can help you fill out the message box. So this is kind of, at the moment, filled in with questions that you should consider. Importantly, Nancy Barron and Compass correctly point out that before you can start to fill in your own message box, you need to decide who your audience is. And that's why we went through Dr. McHugh's section first. And since you'll often need to address different audiences, depending on the situation, you might also decide that you want to create a message box for each individual audience that you're talking about. In fact, it's a good idea to create a few for those occasions where you will be addressing different audiences. In each section of the box, there are some questions that can help you flesh out your points that you'll want to include. The issue section typically identifies and describes the topic that you're addressing in broad terms. It's the big picture context for you, and it should be represented in a short, concise, clear phrase. The problem section, where some of you want to start, should contain the piece of the larger issue that you're addressing. It reflects your work and your expertise. One way to tailor this to a specific audience you've identified is to think about your own research questions, kind of like we discussed on the last slide, and which aspect of a scientific question or problem would matter to that specific audience. So what, which was the other common answer in the chat, that's really at the heart of the message box, even though it's off to the side. Why should your audience care? And what about your research is important for them to know? This answer could really change depending on the audience, which is one of the reasons to identify the audience ahead of time. For scientists, the so what piece can be difficult because we run the risk of imposing our own values, and not everybody shares those values. Where possible, kind of as we've discussed previously, it's a good idea to understand the people you're talking to in order to truly understand what motivates them and what's important to them. It gets back to the need for us to really build a relationship with communities over time by listening to them, conveying shared values, and things like that. So hopefully some of this understanding can at least begin in the audience grid exercise that Molly went over. The solution section talks about the options that you've identified to solve the problem. There may be many solutions that you've identified or many possible solutions, but they all might not be relevant for the particular audience that you're speaking to. So you have to ask yourself that question. When considering what solutions you want to include in your message box, think about whether your audience can do anything about them. If it's a solution that the audience can do something about, it's probably smart to include it. Finally, the benefits section should include the good things that would happen if the solutions take hold. It's related to the so what section of why people should care and focuses on the positive outcomes of taking action. And one thing you'll see kind of missing from this message box is any reference to methods. And that's intentional. There's, for the most part, nobody truly really cares about how you're going about it, except for people who really understand what you're doing. So unless the methods are super relevant, there's probably not a need to include them in your message box. And that's not to say they're not important. Of course they're important, but for the most part, audiences don't need to know how the sausage is made, I guess, all the time. Yeah.
And would you say it's fair to say, Mike, that part of that is once you move outside of an audience of other scientists, public is going to trust, hopefully will trust that you're doing science in the right way. You don't have to demonstrate it to them.
I think that's definitely fair. I know as a reporter, in a number of news organizations that is a given that scientists are the experts generally. Of course, everybody has to vet, but absolutely. And I think generally good news organizations are a reflection of the public that they serve. And I believe that that's generally well understood too.
Yeah.
So
in my mind, that's one of the cruxes that's different between communicating to non-scientific audiences and scientific audiences. We are trained to demonstrate to other scientists that the way that we went about the research to come to our conclusions is a really important part of the argument that our conclusions are valid.
mm-hmm.
And we're trained to do that in communicating science. But we don't have to do that piece when we communicate to the general public. And it feels really uncomfortable to not do that for scientists because it's so ingrained in us
Sure.
that we must demonstrate that our methods were correct. And that's why we know our answers are correct or our conclusions are correct with their own limitations.
That's a really good point. And thanks for bringing that up, because it kind of speaks to how, it's not easy. You're not, following your instincts is important, but also being really intentional is important as well. And that just means thinking as much as possible about whom you're speaking to.
I can honestly say sometimes not saying anything about the method makes me almost feel sick to my stomach. It's so hardwired in my brain as a scientist that I have to justify that, right? So like there's this level of discomfort that really I think is important for people to embrace and understand when
Sure.
we're trying to communicate to other audiences.
Sure. And again, sometimes it is important if it's really novel, if the methods haven't been used before or are in their infancy or something like that. I think they probably do warrant talking about. But again, there's really no magic bullet. Suffice to say that for the most part, people don't need to know about the methods. This is what the slide we're looking at now is what a message box would look like if I created it. Actually, this one comes specifically from a science communicator named Dr. Craig Cormick, and he filled this out from the science communicator standpoint. The audience is people who think communicating science is easy. The issue is simplifying complex science is difficult. The problem, as you can see, simplifying science doesn't do it justice and ignores important nuance. That is definitely true, and it's something that we always have to work on as science communicators and scientists. The so what for the communicator might be poorly communicated science could be ignored, misunderstood, or cause confusion and potentially lead to misinformation in the wrong hands. So it's a really imperative thing to get correct. A solution for the science communicator might be to incorporate tools like the message box to better develop key messages about science. And finally, the benefit a science communicator might convey is that a simple message compared to a complex message has a better chance of getting through to people. And the truth is, we're all science communicators here, whether we've realized it or not. And as such, this particular message box could apply to all of us. But we'll also just look briefly on the next slide at a message box that is more science specific, or a more specific issue at least. And certainly not going to ask you to read through all of this now, but just so you know, it's going to be a part of the presentation that's going to be linked at the Research Day website. You can always access it. But I do want to at least talk about a couple of points on this. And this comes from Compass Science Communication from a woman named Dr. Anna Neal. She's a research scientist at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Research and Development. She leads a group called EnviroAtlas, which is an open source online tool that allows users to view, analyze, download geospatial data and other resources related to the benefits that humans get from nature. She put this together as part of a Compass workshop to illustrate how the work of EnviroAtlas can inform strategies for different communities to improve their physical spaces, ideally add more green spaces. And she geared this one to the area where she lives, which is Durham, North Carolina. Suffice to say that although there is kind of a lot of text here, it started out, her original message box started out with a lot more. She had a lot more to say about trees and green space and the science behind how they work in urban versus natural settings. Ultimately, she arrived at these key points for an audience that could use them, urban planners, city planners, to help craft policy. She came to this message by whittling down and leaving out certain things. And when you get to reading it, what you realize is that she didn't discuss the science behind how native trees and plants reduce air, water, and noise pollutants, because that probably would have cluttered her message. Rather, the audience, as she understood, just needed to know that they do reduce those things and that they have important benefits for the city. And so that's this is a good example, and it's something I'd recommend taking a little time with if you're reviewing this presentation at some point. And we have links to other message box examples that you can look at as well. And some tips to creating it. You might have many drafts of your message box, just like Dr. Neal did prior to that one. The first of which will have too much detail. With each subsequent draft, you want to think about what really matters and make choices about what is most important. Edit out that which is not most important. You want to support your message with data, but limit the number of ideas. And that gets back to the concept that we can only retain 3 to 5 things at a time. It's a good idea to limit the use of numbers and statistics, but you might want to include them if they're illustrative or something that you really want the audience to remember. Use specific examples and make them memorable if you can. Use easy, clear metaphors if you can. Metaphors and analogies we talk about a lot and how important they are. Compare numbers and concepts with familiar things. So if you're talking about a large swath of land, like 5 million acres, people want to be able to contextualize that. Say, you can make a comparison and say it's roughly the size of Connecticut and Delaware combined, something like that. Next one, there it is again, get rid of the jargon. As you're rereading your message box, are you using words your family members would understand? It's important to think about that. And start off with what you know. Of course, uncertainty exists in all science endeavors, and it might be important to acknowledge that, but don't start out with what you don't know, because it'll bury your message in caveats. Start out with what you do know so that you can engage your audience right away. And we can't emphasize this enough either. Listen and engage and incorporate what you learn from listening to your audience into future messaging.